Thanks everyone for being here and for your interest in the work of the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Centre. I'm Executive Director at the AC CDC, and the work that I'll be presenting is not just my work, it's the work of all the botanists on our team, which in this past year has included Colin Chapman and Caitlin Porter, and for a small contract, Jeremy Lundholm. So I will be telling you about what we found, some of the highlights from our projects in Nova Scotia, and a little bit about some of the other associated work that we did. First of all, a very big piece of work that we're responsible for working with the provincial government every 5 years is to update status ranks for every species. So this is part of a process that all provinces do called the General Status of Wildlife in Canada. And it's supposed to be on the zeros and fives every 5 years, but it's always a couple of years behind. And so last year we were basically wrapping up all these ranks, and the ranks changed in our database. So that's why I'm mentioning it now. So we look at each species and decide, does this species maybe need some review, maybe not. For those that need review, we take a very close look using a standardized method, an Excel matrix file that you enter information on provincial range, area of occupancy, number of occurrences, threats, and trends. And this Excel file pumps out a recommended status rank, an S rank. And we can choose to modify that slightly, but typically we'll choose to accept the rank. It makes for a more standardized approach. So that process resulted in adding 28 new native species to the Nova Scotia flora since the last 5-year entry, the 2015 entry. They're not actually all completely new. Some of them are just taxonomic changes where records have been transferred from one species to another. 31 new exotic species added. Those are mostly new species that have only just been found or confirmed to be outside of cultivation in Nova Scotia. We took off 17 species. Some of those, well, 14 of those were taxonomic changes, and 3 of those were cases where we found that the original record had been in error. And we had 262 different species that had some other rank change. That's quite a high percentage of the flora, and it shows how much we're learning over time. In 92% of those cases, the species have gone from a more threatened category to a less threatened category. So that's good news. As we go out there and find new species and new locations of species, we realize that some of the plants we thought were very rare aren't as rare as we believed. This picture shows cinnamon willow herb, which is very similar to the really abundant fringed willow herb, or Epilobium ciliatum. And just in the past 5 years especially, we've been recognizing how common this one is. So this is a kind of an extreme example where it went from S2, which is quite rare and potentially threatened, to S4, where we believe it's quite secure. You tell it by the more pointy sepals that you can see there, as well as the seeds, which turn brown when they're being released, the hairs on the seeds, like the fluff, kind of like a dandelion. Some other examples of changes. Some species change because their ranks initially weren't developed. They were developed before we were using the rank calculator quite a long time ago, and they hadn't been reviewed in detail, like this estuary beggar's ticks. We had found some new records for this on the River Phillip, where it was already known. We basically found that it's quite common in the tidal stretch of the River Phillip. That's that little yellow flowered one there. It's a special beggar's ticks that only occurs in tidal waters. It's quite uncommon in Nova Scotia, but where it occurs, there's a lot of it, and it occurs in habitats that cannot be developed very readily. So we believe it's quite secure. So its rank was changed from S1 to S3, mostly because of a more careful look at existing facts. A lot of other cases we're changing ranks because of more facts coming to light, more locations coming to light, as I mentioned. And some more examples of that are the russet cotton grass, Eriophorum ruseolum, which can occur in very, very large patches in wet peatlands, especially in the north, around the Northumberland Strait, my region, the border region. A very favorite plant of mine. It looks, it can be so bright orange when it's in peak fruit there, and occur in these bright patches blowing around in the wind. Another example where we found an especially large number of new sites was Lobelia calmei. This was because we did a lot of concentrated effort trying to find fens and fen-like conditions up in the calcareous regions of Cape Breton. So that's a pretty rare plant in Nova Scotia, all in all. It's in quite a special habitat for the most part, but now we know there's enough of it that we're calling it an S3 species, a basically uncommon rather than quite rare. So that was a big project. That was a big indoor project. And it's reflected in the ranks that are in our database now. I'll tell you now about some of our different field projects, which is what people tend to be most interested in. We'll start off up in southern Cape Breton within the Brador Lakes watershed. And the dots on the map there show you where we were. They represent the species of concern that were noted. Basically, everywhere we go, we're finding some species of concern. Except, now the one long area in the center left, that was my route along the Humes River, and I only found a few species of concern and a lot of species of no conservation concern. Anyhow, the project is supported, or it's a project that's run by the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, an Indigenous group in Cape Breton, and that the program is funded by an Environment and Climate Change Canada program called the Community Nominated Priority Places for Species at Risk. So the project name in Mi'kmaq means taking care of all our relations, and it's a project to protect species at risk habitat, identify and protect species at risk habitat. Our work this year focused on trying to find more black ash, species of special interest to Unama'ki, and that meant looking at calcareous river floodplains and swamps. We also looked at species at risk lichens, which I won't mention here, but the total work on the project covered 24 person days and 12 sites, which are mapped out there. A few little highlights. We had 4 different taxa in the vascular plant world that were new for Nova Scotia. Colin Chapman found this type of club moss, the Pacific fir moss. This is quite an obscure species. This group of club mosses in the genus Huperzia is not, well, there's still a lot to be learned about them, including new species that have been described fairly recently, and greater understanding of how these different not very distinct species are distributed. This is a predominantly Western taxon, but it is disjunct in a number of places all the way to Newfoundland. And it joins a group of other plants that are sort of cordilleran in nature, as in from the Rocky Mountains, but are present in the moist, cool ravines of Cape Breton. And some of those other ones would be the Goodyear oblongifolia, the Menzies rattlesnake plantain, male fern, Kamchatka bedstraw, Galium kamchaticum. So it's kind of a pattern of montane species being in Cape Breton. Some of the other interesting things that Colin found were European water plantain. It's quite similar to our native North American water plantain, but it is an introduced species from Europe, and it had never been noted in Nova Scotia before. One of the distinguishing features is that the petals of the flowers are pinkish, which you can see in that picture, and they're a little bit longer than our species petals. And he found a rare Avens hybrid maybe rare, maybe not so rare, maybe just hard to detect. It's a hybrid called Cortland avens, named after Cortland, New York, where the discoverer resides. And it's a hybrid of the two fairly common species of floodplain habitats, Canada avens or white avens and slashed avens, Geum canadense and laciniatum. And we even got the identification confirmed by Mike Huff, who works at State University of New York at Cortland. He's the one who described this taxon. And my record there is that patch of Viola odorata, this Eurasian sweet blue violet. This is something that is an old-fashioned garden plant. It's probably present around old settlements widely, but it had never been recorded in the wild before. It was a huge patch that had formed from an abandoned garden and had spread probably in a radius of almost 10 meters. So I'm now counting that as a member of the Nova Scotia wild flora. A bit marginal, but it was new. So this is a beautiful picture of Humes River. That was that long stretch of walking that I did where I didn't find a lot of rare species. Most of the rivers that we visited in this project were a bit more calcareous. The bedrock was more basic. This is kind of a marginally basic to slightly acidic bedrock. It's a beautiful spot, which is now protected as a wilderness area. And it has a lot of very old forest, quite a long continuous stretch of old forest along the river itself. You can see some big hemlocks and big white pines there. But the calcareous rivers were some of the most interesting things that we covered in this project, especially the Middle River. And Colin Chapman, in his section of the Middle River, got quite a lot of interesting plants, including these ones that you'll probably be familiar with, the blue cohosh and wild coffee or tinker's weed. And one that's a little less obscure but quite rare is Wiegand's wild rye. That's a very big grass. It can grow up to be about 6 or 7 feet tall with a huge arching, drooping inflorescence and very broad leaves. That's pretty rare, especially rare in Cape Breton. There's only 1 or 2 other records in Cape Breton. Few more plants of these calcareous rivers that are kind of special. The long-styled sweet cicely or anise root. If you look at the seeds on the right there, you can see the long styles, which are the female receptive structures that collect the pollen. And that's a good way to distinguish the plant. It's also very strongly licorice scented and licorice tasting as well, if you chew on the seeds. Very sweet, tasty licorice plant. Oh, the other thing about it is the big bracts underneath the umbel of flowers or seeds. You can see they're sort of big and leafy. That's different from some of the other sweet cicelies, which are otherwise quite similar. Colin had one site at a little side ravine called Boffin Brook with pale jewelweed, the yellow, one of the touch-me-nots or jewelweeds. Also very indicative of calcareous soils, pretty uncommon in Nova Scotia. Sometimes common where it occurs, but you have to work hard to find this one. On to some calcareous fens. We didn't have a lot of calcareous fen in this project, but we did have one pretty good one that I came across on this River Dennis. Southside River Dennis is the name of the little settlement or hamlet that's there. And it's just a little opening at the edge of a tidal marsh. The tides are pretty close to this spot, but it's probably quite basic soils. It's dominated by the twig rush, which is kind of an indicator plant for fen in some situations. And here are some of the rare species that were present at that site. This little erect 4-petaled bedstraw called Labrador bedstraw, fen specialist. All 3 of these are fen specialist species. a form of the more common greenish sedge, Carex virgula, called variety elatior, which is sometimes considered a separate species, called Carex lepidocarpa. If you look for it in iNaturalist, that's what it's called, the Carex lepidocarpa, long-stalked green sedge, and a boreal aster, more slender version of the New England aster, basically. Very nice little habitat. We're moving on to a second project here. This was one that was funded by the Nova Scotia Department of Environment and by their wetland specialist, Ian Bryson. And he was interested in further developing the definition of wetlands of special significance, or sort of understanding to what extent potential wetlands of special significance occurred on the landscape, but were not yet designated. So this is an official designation under the wetlands policy for Nova Scotia. And these wetlands of special significance automatically include all salt marshes, all wetlands which are in a variety of types of designated areas like provincial parks, wilderness areas, Ramsar sites, and so on, and watershed protected areas for municipal water supplies, and places where species, legally listed species at risk, are present. But there's lots of wetlands.
Right. Yeah.
Lots of different wetlands might be also considered special significant. And so they're working on refining definitions that may include other significant species or assemblages of species, high biodiversity, significant hydrology, or social and cultural significance. So we looked at 5 different sites fairly close to Sackville. The choice to do it close to Sackville was primarily for convenience, but there are interesting and somewhat richer soiled wetlands in this region. So I only did one of these sites. Most of the records that I'll highlight will be from that one that I did. My site included a long string of wetlands, a lot of them looking kind of like this, with marshy edges, somewhat rich, often beaver influenced. The landscape surrounding the wetlands was mostly quite heavily cut over forest, as is the case in most of lowland Cumberland County. But there's a few rare species that you can find on logging roads. This is one that I really like. It's called blood milkwort, also called candy tufts in some sources. These pink bits that you see on the flower are not actually petals, they're bracts, and there are just little tiny flowers hidden inside the bracts there. But this is a plant that you see almost exclusively on the edges of logging roads when you find it. I had one population of that with this project. Another one that's expanding and logging, very much disturbance associated, logging roads and gravel pits and so on, is this small flowered false foxglove. And I put a little question mark on this. There's more to be learned about these false foxgloves in Nova Scotia, or maybe the keys are not as good, don't actually work as well as you might hope. We have the Nova Scotia false foxglove, which is almost endemic to Nova Scotia. And it's quite common in the southern part of the province. You find it on every moist logging road you go on down south of Halifax. That one is supposed to have very long sepals, which is the case here, but it also has in the southern part of Nova Scotia, it has kind of a different look than this one. The leaves aren't nearly as long and skinny, and the plant is more of a short, robust look. So I think this one is more likely the more broadly common, but less common in Nova Scotia, small flowered one. But we could use some more research on that. Colin Chapman relocated an old find that I'd had on Lake Killarney, which is a bit north and east of Oxford, I guess. This is an aquatic plant, pretty rare in Nova Scotia, called eelgrass, not the eelgrass that occurs offshore, but a freshwater eelgrass. Really neat plant. You can see those corkscrew or curled up flowering stems. The female flowering stems are curled up, have this curling stem, and the male flowers are released to float on the water. And then they just float around until they bump into a female flower and do the pollination that way. And then when the pollination occurs and the seeds are developing, the plant coils that spring-like stem up and pulls the developing seed pod underwater where it's safer from predation. Many of the other uncommon plants that we saw on this project were aquatics of beaver pondish or small lake, small rich lake habitats. These are two of them. A type of buttercup called the small water crowfoot, and the prickly hornwort. That bit that has the long extensions on it sticking out of the top end of the prickly hornwort is the seed. You don't see that very often. That was quite neat. We have a more common species of hornwort or at least a more widely recognized in the past species of hornwort, which doesn't have as much branching as this one. And when it has seeds, it doesn't have the long spikes sticking out the side of the seeds. A final little aquatic plant of fairly calcareous waters that we found on this project was small burr reed. You might be familiar with some of the larger kinds of burr reed. This one is much smaller than most of the others. It's mostly submerged aquatic. These little clusters of seeds, which give it the burr name, are only about as wide as a penny to a nickel sort of width, and the seeds themselves have not much of a beak on them. That tells it from other burr reeds. And the flower, there's a flowering plant example there that's got the male flowers on the top, which are just stamens, male only, and then the female flowers on the bottom that develop into those seeds. All right, on to one of our biggest projects of the summer. This is in southern Nova Scotia. As part of the Environment and Climate Change Canada funded Gispuckwick Priority Place, Southwest Nova Scotia Priority Place, the funding goes from the federal government to Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources, who administers it and funded our project. So our initial intention in this first year of a multi-year project was to go out onto lake shores and try to find various lake shores and river shores and try to find some of the special coastal plain flora of those habitats. But you may remember that it was pretty wet in the summer and the water levels were too high for lakeshore fieldwork. The plants that would have been to be looked for would have been underwater, hard to detect, or potentially not even growing much this year. So we switched our focus to peatlands, which was going to be our year 2. And this region, which is west of Liverpool, south of Mersey River for the most part, and Lake Rossignol, south of Kejimkujik, has a lot of peatlands. All that color that you can see in the center of the circled area, almost all of it is not clear cut, which is what pale colors often mean when you're looking at aerial photos. Most of that is actually large peatlands. So it's a real concentration of peatlands. And one of those peatlands, the Dunraven Bog that's marked there, was known to have Lophiula aurea, the golden crest, a very special plant for Nova Scotia. And we've looked at a few of them. We found there's quite a lot of Long's bulrush in this region, another species at risk, a special concern species. So we were confident that we could find some more Long's bulrush if we looked further in these sites, and we were hopeful that we might find some golden crest. But there are not many bogs in Nova Scotia, in interior Nova Scotia, that are known to have golden crest. We had a small project, which I won't otherwise mention. We're looking at some sites for the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. They were interested in proposed wilderness areas that have not yet been officially designated, and having us take a look and see if we could find things that helped that final designation process along. So one of the sites that we looked at was the Long Lake Bog proposed wilderness area south of Tony Lake. And that site was before we'd gotten on to the Southwest Nova Scotia big project, and it did indeed have golden crest. This is the habitat that we're looking at. This is a big peatland, but it's more of a nutrient poor fen than it is a bog. There's lots of shrubby plants in this portion of the habitat, but they're very low. They're very, very stunted by high water conditions, seasonal high water conditions. And there's a little bit more nutrient coming into these habitats compared to the raised peatland through groundwater. So you get a different dominant vegetation dominated by grasses and sedges primarily. And the wet portions of these habitats are where we look for our special species, the golden crest and Long's bulrush. So golden crest is a monocot. It's related to lilies, but it's in its own special family of which we have no other members, except for redroot. And it's pretty scarce. It's in Nova Scotia. There's some occurrences on bogs on the Digby Neck and down to Briar Island. It's been extirpated from the Briar Island bog because of changes there. And then there's sites on some of the big lakes, Ponhook and Maliga Lake and that area. And then there's a few bogs that have it. So it was exciting to find this. And we didn't just find one occurrence. Once we'd found that one, we looked intensely for more, and we found two others. So that's a big addition to what's known about this plant. So this is a real coastal plain disjunct. The next nearest occurrences of this plant are down in New Jersey. So it's really strange and interesting that there are as many plant places where it occurs in Nova Scotia as there are. I mentioned Long's bulrush. This was a little bit more expected. It is a special concern species. It is only in southern Nova Scotia within Canada, but there are getting to be quite a lot of occurrences of this species known, up towards 40 at this point. We added 6 new ones in our 12 bog sites that we visited. You can recognize Long's bulrush because it grows in these big circular clones. Usually you don't see any flowering stems, but this year, for whatever reason, we found more flowering stems more sites with flowering stems than I've ever seen in a year before. And that gave me a chance to get a good picture that shows the difference between this species and the more common woolgrass bulrush, Scirpus cyperinus and Scirpus atrocinctus. The hairs on the seeds, which are just starting to stick out in this plant, are white. That's really different. The bracts around the inflorescence, those big black sort of leafy bits, are sticky in this species, and that's different from the other species. And the flowering stems, or the inflorescence itself, is huge. It can be much bigger than you'd ever see on one of the common species. It can be almost, probably exceeding 30 centimeters long. Quite a big, spectacular stem. That was interesting to see. Few of the other species that we found, well, we were looking for the La Fiola, the golden crest, and Long's bulrush. one very nice population of the Michaud's dwarf birch, really neat looking little shrub with tiny fingernail sized leaves, but with birch catkins that produce seeds just like the tree birches do. That's a bog plant, an uncommon one in mostly southern Nova Scotia. We happened across a roadside occurrence as we were driving from a site of this netted chain fern. It used to be Woodwardia areolata, now it's called Lawrenceria areolata. Also in Canada, only in southern Nova Scotia, but in the southernmost part of Nova Scotia, quite common. We were a bit north of its heartland in Nova Scotia, but we only got one site. But it's a neat fern. You can see the fertile fronds there with the big sori that are actually showing through. They're on the bottom side, but the leaf is sort of contracted around them, and you can see them. That's where the spores are produced. And the non-fertile or sterile leaves that are more have more of a blade to them, more flattened. It's kind of like the sensitive fern, but with a bit of a different look and a very different fertile frond. Another example of a species that we had a few records for is yellow screw stem here. This is in the gentian family. It's a largely parasitic plant. So it takes its nutrients from other plants' roots. That's why it doesn't have much green to it, not much chlorophyll to produce its own food. We have two of these kinds of screw stems. There's a more common one that is more of a whitish or, well, purplish to whitish color, I guess. And it is the Bartonia paniculata subspecies Iodandra. The way that you tell these apart is that they're paired, the color for one, and the flowers being a little bit different, but they have a paired branching pattern or an opposite branching pattern in Bartonia virginica. Here's a neat little plant. I only saw the plant on the part of it on the left, which is the leaves and the bladders in a fragment that would normally be growing out of the bottom of shallow water, but had become detached. The flower picture I took from the internet, but this is called reverse bladderwort because the flowers kind of look like they've been turned inside out. They're one of our two species of bladderworts that has purple flowers as opposed to yellow ones. It's a small and obscure species that only flowers when water levels go down sufficiently to expose it above the water's surface. It's a carnivorous plant, like all bladderworts. Those little bladders actually capture little swimming organisms in the water. They have a trigger that opens up if something small enough swims by and touches the trigger hairs, and it sucks them inside by because it's a vacuum to begin with, and it opens up and the water goes inside, sucks in the organism, and the plant digests it and gets its nitrogen that way. The second aspect of our southern Nova Scotia fieldwork was more southern, right down near the southern tip of the province, south of Shelburne, looking for new sites for threadleaf sundew. This map shows with green dots the known locations of threadleaf sundew. There's only 5 of them, from the Quinns Meadow site up near Clyde River in the north down to Baccarat in the south. There are lots of peatlands, lots of big peatlands with similar looking habitats surrounding these known sites. Some of them have been looked at, some of them haven't. We covered most of the areas marked by red lines in this map. Not every little bit, but most of what you see there. And we found no new threadleaf sundew. It seems to be a really legitimately very rare plant in Nova Scotia. Sadly, we did spend 8 days between Caitlin Porter and myself looking for threadleaf sundew. Here's an example of the type of place we were in. This is at Bowers Meadows Wilderness Area, which is one of the most trespassed with ATV wilderness areas that we have. That track is from some new kind of ATV that has tank treads and is as wide as a regular vehicle. So that's an unfortunate new addition to the Nova Scotia landscape, I might say. Here's a neat little fern. Some of you will undoubtedly know this fern. It's not that rare. It's quite expectable in almost any large bog you go into in southern Nova Scotia. It's also on lake shores at times too. But I put the picture in because it's a really neat plant and because I finally got an in focus picture of this plant, which is hard to get in focus. I had really good light in a gravel pit where I found this growing. So those are little fern fronds that are folded over on themselves and have the spores in the middle. And you can see the leaves, the sterile leaves at the bottom of the plant, which are spiral in form. That's why it's called the curly grass fern. It is a tiny little plant, as you can probably judge by comparing it with the size of the sundews nearby. Special plant to see. Nova Scotia is pretty much the only place in Canada where it's common. In that very same gravel pit, I found this comb-leaved mermaid weed, another special Nova Scotia species, which is related to the water milfoils, but is a somewhat more terrestrial, or at least above the water surface wetland plant. Different from the related mermaid weed because it's got highly dissected leaves. It's comb-like leaves. Another thing that we learned more about this past summer was the Canada cinquefoil. This is a plant that was just eluding us because it's so similar to the really abundant common cinquefoil, which I'm showing on the bottom left. The leaf shape is different and the leaf size is different. It tends to be a smaller plant and the leaves tend to be fatter and blunter tipped. And the flowers are coming up out of the stem, out of the nodes, right from near the base, where they tend to wait a few nodes before they flower on the common cinquefoil. So we found this at several spots, and I'm starting to understand how Roland and Smith managed to compile a fair number of records in their book, The Old Flora of Nova Scotia. I was always curious how I was missing this species so much, but I seem to have gotten an eye for it now. You find it in blueberry barren habitats and open roadside edges. Another disturbance tolerant plant, which we used to keep track of as a rare species in Nova Scotia, but we've now bumped it down to S4 because it's quite common on roads, and it's very much not threatened because it likes disturbance so much. I wanted to point it out because even though it's a rush and it's a little bit obscure looking, it's quite easy to identify. If you're down in Shelburne County, Yarmouth County, and you're walking roadsides, seeing a grassy zone that's starting to revegetate after having been scraped off maybe 5-10 years ago, watch for these somewhat reddish rush species with little clusters, almost circular clusters or spherical clusters of flowers. And then check the leaves. It's called grass-leaved rush because the leaf is flattened. Most rushes would have rounded leaves. And if you see this combination of characters, you can identify this otherwise quite obscure plant. Oh, I did. I put comb leaf mermaid weed in there twice. I thought I'd lost my slide of it, so I have it twice. But we'll ignore that one, and we'll talk about this Nova Scotia near endemic, a variety of cases ladies tresses. The ladies tresses are a tricky group of orchids. They're pretty common, especially in southern Nova Scotia, on roadside habitats, regenerating disturbed sites. And they've become quite a bit more common in recent years with a botanist out of New York Botanical Garden who's separated out several new species. This one was known as a separate species and separate variety before his work, but it's not highly well understood in Nova Scotia because it's hard to identify. So I found one location of this plant, and it has been confirmed by some of the world experts in ladies tresses. This one has fairly small, slightly yellowish flowers and tightly clustered on the flowering stem there. Moving on to the final project or group of projects that I'll mention in this talk. We had some interesting fieldwork at sites owned by the Nature Conservancy of Canada. These are relatively new additions to the spectacular network of nature reserves that Nature Conservancy of Canada has in Nova Scotia. They're all fairly sizable sites, and they're all in quite different parts of Nova Scotia, as you can see there. There's one site that was right on the Nova Scotia-New Brunswick border. That was donated by the Kammerer family. I looked up online, and the Kammerer family has decided, I guess, to have this site named as the Giving and Receiving Nature Reserve in recognition of their patriarch who bought the land and who they donated in memory of. Then we have two sites up in the gypsum country, gypsum sinkhole country of Bredor Lake, called the Hughes property and the Pavlin property. And then a very big property called the Upper Ohio property north of Shelburne in a wilderness region down there. That's the one that I'll be predominantly mentioning. Here's a closer look at the site itself. You can see the scale bar is 2 kilometers long there. So this is a big site. That's probably 7 kilometers across there, roughly. And it touches on the shorelines of 6 different lakes. It has some patches of old growth forest, especially old growth swamp forest, which is a very good habitat for rare lichens. And we had great success finding rare lichens in there, but I'm doing a vascular plant talk here, so we'll ignore those. Most of the sites that are marked as species at risk there with the big white circles are lichens. Some of them are species at risk birds. We didn't have a lot of species at risk plants, but we did have some interesting flora there. We had a record of the downy rattlesnake plantain, which is one of my favorite orchids. Those leaves have such a vivid pattern. All the rattlesnake plantains have this checkered look to them, but the downy rattlesnake plantain is the nicest looking one in my estimation. Very thick white central line and very crisp, well-defined, bright white network of patterning through the rest of the leaf. So that's more of a southern Nova Scotia specialty. Doesn't occur in Nova Scotia much north of Hants County, roughly. And it's one that seems to be probably somewhat dependent on older forests, so a bit threatened in some of the places where it occurs. This really interesting plant, I don't have a good picture of it, these are internet pictures, is called American cancer root, Canophilus americana. It is a fully parasitic plant. It is parasitic in the same way as a Indian pipe is, mediated by a fungal connection, and then it connects to oak roots. So it's only associated with red oak in Nova Scotia. So it looks like a crazy kind of cob of corn when it's flowering, and then they shrivel right up. They're kind of fleshy, and over the summer they shrivel right up and turn into something looking quite ugly, looking kind of like some kind of animal dropping. But this plant is known from the Annapolis Valley, from places in the oak forest along the North Mountain and around Kentville. And there's a big population of it at Grafton Lake in Ketchimpkujuk. Many of you might have seen it at that spot. But otherwise, and it's also on the Lahave River, but otherwise it's not much known from other places in Nova Scotia. It's not known in New Brunswick, which is kind of interesting. So it's quite a disjunct Nova Scotia occurrence. And this was well separated from any other place. So this is down in Yarmouth County, and it was not known down there before. Caitlin Porter found this. Good find. A few of the other species of conservation concern, it's more borderline conservation concern. This is swamp loosestrife, Decadon verticillatus. This is a slightly woody plant. It's got a very tough woody base, and it sends out the shoots that arch over, and then once the shoots hit the water, the stems get very sort of weird and corky, and if they can manage to, they'll root and form a new clump at the end of these long drooping stems going into the water. It's related to purple loosestrife, but a different genus, and native, of course, not a invasive species like purple loosestrife. It's a fairly widespread species in southern Nova Scotia, but certainly not on every lake. And the lake shores on this site had some of the expectable, marginally rare, but very typical southern Nova Scotia Atlantic coastal plain flora, like Virginia meadow beauty and the Atlantic or eastern blue-eyed grass. That one you can tell from the other blue-eyed grasses by its really skinny stem, and the flowers tend to be a little bit paler than the common Cicerynchium montanum. And it has a branch stem. Montanum doesn't have these extensive branching of the stem. So moving away from southern Nova Scotia, I'll just highlight one other find with the Nature Conservancy work, this special hybrid club moss, which is in the same club moss group as that Pacific fir moss that I mentioned earlier. I'm almost certain this is the hybrid called Butter's hybrid fir moss, which is a cross between the more common hardwood forest species, shining fir moss, shining club moss, and the much rarer, often bog dwelling Huperzia selago. We'll just call that bog fir moss. I don't remember the common name of that one. But this hybrid combination had never been detected in Nova Scotia before. And it's pretty interesting because the bog fir moss, one of the parent species, is not known anywhere nearby. So either this is a long distance spore dispersal, or a remnant from some undetected population, or resulting from some undetected population. So that, I think, represents the end of my slides that I'm showing. But I'll mention a bit about what we're up to for next year. We will be down in Southwest Nova Scotia again, doing some of that lake field work, I hope, that we were unable to do because of water levels this year, looking especially for tubercled spikebrush, and perhaps looking at some additional peatlands for those same species we were looking at this year. We'll likely be doing more work in the Brador on the priority place project there. I'm hoping and expecting that we'll be doing some site inventory work for some of our partner organizations like Nature Conservancy of Canada and perhaps others. And one thing I'll point out, we have one of our new staff members on this call, Ian Crowell, who we're very pleased to add to our team, along with a botanist who's come to us from Ontario, a very experienced botanist named Burke Coral, who has worked with Environment Canada and with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. And you may know him from iNaturalist because he's been identifying a ton of Nova Scotia material on iNaturalist of late. But you'll get to meet these folks potentially in future talks like this one. So with that, I will leave things and open things up for questions. I hope people are still with us.
Yes.
Don, it's Wendy here. I just want you to remind us your mode of travel. You're either wearing hip waders or have the luxury of a canoe on some of these outings.
Yes, well, I don't wear hip waders. I find that they are pretty uncomfortable, and they just fill up with water and cause problems if you go over them. I walk with old running shoes, and so we do some canoeing. Most of this work was not done by canoe. Some of the lake work in that southern Nova Scotia site up for Ohio involved canoeing. But for the peatlands, you kind of just have to keep walking. And sometimes that means walking in fairly deep water. There was one place where there was a stream that went through the big peatland and I had to get across. I thought I was picking a pretty good place to go across, but as I walked across, I eventually got to a point where my hat floated off my head.
Sorry.
I swam onward and a few steps later got to retrieve my hat and get above water again. So sometimes it's pretty wet, but on the warm summer days, that's not so much of a problem.
The other question I had was about this community nominated priority places for species at risk.
Yes.
Is that something new? Is that?
It's fairly new. It's a long name for a program. So Environment and Climate Change Canada developed a strategy towards species at risk where they said we can't work everywhere and we want to set some priority areas that have a lot of species at risk together, and we will concentrate our work there. And so that's the origin of priority place, the term priority place. And they identified a certain number of priority places and then opened the floor essentially to have environmental groups identify other priority places. So the community nominated ones are ones where a group has developed a proposal to say, we think this would be a good place for work on species at risk. And the ones that Environment Canada has approved become these community nominated priority places. And the program itself is about 3 to 4 years old at this point.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy.
Don,
Yes, on.
you said at the beginning of your presentation that there were 262 species with rank changes and 92% of which were positive. I'm just wondering if I understood you correctly in that this reflects more an increase in knowledge than it reflects an increase in population of the plants themselves. And also, if it doesn't represent all of them, are there some that increase ranks because of climate change?
Yes. To start with the first aspect of your question, yes, it's definitely an increase in knowledge as the predominant factor in the rank change, the rank changes. So as we learn more, we are more confident that these species are not as threatened as they might have been considered in the past. We take kind of a precautionary approach. We consider how much unknown population might be out there, but you can't assume that there's thousands of plants when you've only found 2 of them, 2 sites. So once we found more, the rank will tend to go up. And then related to plants that may be actually increasing on the ground, that's sometimes the case. More often than not, that's associated with a human disturbance, plants that like roadside conditions or other types of disturbance. And probably there's a climate change factor involved in a lot of those plants as well. A lot of them are species that are basically spreading northward, but it's hard to determine to what extent the previous limiting factor was climate versus just they hadn't arrived here and now they're taking advantage of roadsides. And so, and when we do ranking, we take the climate change into consideration. I'm much more hesitant to revise the ranks to less threatened categories if it's a species that is strongly northern in affinity, like the more alpine or high boreal plants of Cape Breton. Even if we're finding a bunch more locations, I'm not so likely to change the rank very much. And vice versa to a certain extent. If it's a southern species that is highly, well, has been highly rare, but we found a few more records of it. I'm not assuming that it's because of climate change, but that's a more of a factor where it's unlikely to be threatened by climate change in terms of a warmer conditions. So we would have less concern about species that are not obviously threatened by some habitat factor and are southern in their affinity, because a warmer climate more likely than not will be good for them.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you.
Did you have a question, David? The hand I saw earlier.
I did. It was more in response to Wendy's comment. I'm heavily involved in the special place around the Bedore that Sean's been talking about, not from the botany point of view, but from the birds and the bees. And so, yeah, it's been around for, this is our 3rd summer. In fact, tomorrow, I'm along with 3 others from Unamaki Institute of Natural Resources interviewing for a couple of summer students to work on the project. So if there are questions, Sean knows everything about the plants and other things I can probably help out on.
Yeah, they're very interesting projects with a lot of partnerships. It's a good program that way, in that it gets a lot of different people together.
I have a question for you, Sean. How can we help with your activities?
Well, certainly we are keen to have any observations of any of our tracked species, and you can download the list of the new ranks right from our website. And uploading to iNaturalist is a great way to get your records into our database. It takes a bit of time for us to get those records from iNaturalist through the process and into our database. So a more immediate route into our database would be to send the records directly. There's instructions for submitting records on our website. And you can go to download an Excel template with all these, with many, many different headings in it for different types of information. The basic type of information that we really, really need is what species it is, what's the geolocation, how accurate do you believe that geolocation is? Is it precise with a GPS, or is it kind of just a rough estimate that might be 500 meters off? What evidence is there that you saw this? Is there a photo or specimen or some other physical evidence? And then beyond that, how many of the species were there? Was it widespread over a broader area than just your point? What kind of habitat was it in? Were there threats to the site? So that's one way to help. I remember the presentation I did last year, which I was looking back on, was it had a bunch of themes identified for potential keeners who wanted to look for rare plants in different special types of habitats. And I'm happy to reshare that presentation with anyone who's interested, or we could have it up on the Wild Flora website somehow if there was interest in that.
I think we may actually have that on our website. I
Okay.
should double check that it's the correct one, but maybe if you can have a look at it, just make sure we've got the same one.
And we're always here to help with advice and with identifications and just general thoughts on where to go. So feel free to contact us, and we can. Yeah, and I do like doing talks and walks. I have not done any events with the Nova Scotia Wild Flora Society outdoor events yet, but I would certainly consider that anytime. It's hard in the summer to fit things in often, but my kids are bigger now, and I don't have to be looking after them all the time, so a little bit freer that way. But yeah, we could probably come up with some interesting events, especially ones that might be a little bit closer to the New Brunswick border that make it easier for me to get to.
Well, Jeff will be in your neighborhood soon too, won't you, Jeff?
Will you?
I was just thinking that. Yeah, I thought, oh, good. These Cumberland County sites you pointed out just now interest me because I'm moving to Cumberland County in July. Up to
Oh,
Amherst.
whereabouts?
Right into Amherst. Yeah.
Oh, well, that's super. I look forward to seeing you.
Yeah, and I look forward to seeing what's in the area. I lived in Cumberland County years ago, but I'm a little more head over heels into the botany now. So
Excellent.
I think doing some activities together would be wonderful. Maybe towards the end of the summer or into the fall or something.
Yeah.
What was it? Yeah.
We will have some extensive work in Southern Nova Scotia this year. We have a postgraduate student, finished his PhD, who's working on a program. I forget it's an internship program out of University of British Columbia that finances his time with us. And so he has about 5 weeks potentially with us. And one of the things that I would like to have him do is work on getting out to some of these remote lakes that might have some tubercle spike rush, might have some super rare stuff that hasn't even been seen before, or not, but it'll be interesting to see what we find.
Anne, do you have your hand up there? Oh, sorry, that's my cursor, my mistake.
No, I didn't.
Sorry.
It's Wendy again. Today I spent time getting my tires changed, so I was busy reading my book, which is currently The Arbor Knot by Meg Lohman. She called A Life Discovering the Eighth Continent in the Trees Above Us.
Wow.
And it's a must read. She's one of the ones who learned how to climb trees to look at the canopy, and then worldwide has helped places install canopy walks. So I was thinking of the spot up in Cape Breton that's going to be doing that, and we need to help them make sure that they're looking at nature while they're building whatever it's going to be. I don't know the details. I've just seen bits and pieces in the paper, but it's called Arbor Knot by Meg Lohman. And I heard about the book on CBC. She was interviewed, and it's talk about discovering new species and so on, because nobody had ever studied the tops of trees. She did her initial research in America and then went to Australia.
I've read the book too, and it's great. It's also really interesting, just as a woman getting into that area and just some of the things she had to go through and just her own personal growth in that. It's a really great, really well-written book.
Yeah, she's a role model for young scientists in the STEM area.
Neat.
Any other questions? Well, I think we're done. So I want to thank you, Sean, on behalf of the Flora Society for yet another wonderful presentation. I mean, it's great to see all the work you guys are doing. Every year it just accumulates and there's more and more. And I particularly love to see the changes in the rankings, and seeing that, you know, as this knowledge accumulates, it's updating, and you know, now there's more things that I can go look for that I have a hope of seeing, I think.
Yeah.
So
Thanks very much, Bob. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks.
Say hi to Becky for me.
I will. We'll see you guys in person sometime.
yes.
Take care, Sean.
Okay.
Take care.
All right.
Thanks, Sean. That was great.